All right, welcome back to today's edition of Standup. I think I got a day behind on this, to be honest with you. I didn't record Friday, so then I didn't do anything over the weekend, so then it came Monday, and I didn't have video, so now I'm a day behind. We'll get back on track, but here is Daily Standup for Tuesday, the 21st, and I think I'm recording my screen, so I kind of shuffled some stuff around. I actually dragged in my research database providers to In Progress, and I want to talk about that because I started to look at Supabase, which was my original plan all along to go with that database provider. I'm shifting from that. I'm not going to use Supabase. I'm actually just going to use MySQL and MySQL Workbench to interact with it. A few reasons is because Supabase, the free tier, really wasn't going to allow me to do what I wanted to do, and I'm gonna reach that cap really fast, and I don't want to pay for anything, so I'm just going to use MySQL because it's free. I really like the idea of Supabase. Like, it's cloud based. I can do everything in the UI as far as making tables and doing all that. But that free tier limits the number of concurrent connections. It limited how many requests you could send. It had a lot of limitations, and I feel like I was going to hit that cap pretty quick, and then then it kicks in on that monthly charge. I don't need that, especially not for when I'm just making this before I deploy it or anything like that. So I'm going to go with MySQL. I don't know yet how I'm going to choose to host my MySQL database, but at any rate, as long as I'm doing local development, I'm going to be using MySQL and MySQL Workbench. So with that being said, I do have to put some notes and stuff that I found for this on my research ticket, so I'm just going to post some notes. So I'm going to say decided to not go with Supabase due to the free tier threshold. Decided to go instead with MySQL and use MySQL Workbench. Okay. And I believe the video posted before this that I put up is part one of getting MySQL, starting to build out the tables, and just generally figuring out the structure of the schema. That's really a lot of thought and work has to go into that. I know the general the general idea, especially of the engines aspect of it, because a video before this, I've made all the equations of everything that I want to find so far. I'm sure I'll add to the equations at some point, but that's what I'm going to do. Now, because it's kind of going to be, in flux a little bit, my schema, and honestly, this is kind of how a lot of real-world projects are, right? You're always thinking of, okay, are we potentially going to have to modify the database, the tables? Hopefully not, because then you're going to have to figure out, okay, we'll have to do an alter statement in our migration next deploy. And there's just some logistical things you have to sort out. I think because of that, and just to make it easier on myself, I was thinking perhaps maybe for read-only operations, I would just create a view in my database that I'll just query. So that way, if I do affect my table structure, at least for the right operations, I'm not going to have to go and modify my my objects in my solution. I don't know yet. Using views so a view is a virtual table, and it's kind of like irrespective of, like, if you add something to the table, your view doesn't change. You would have to recreate the view if you wanted to update it. So let's say I have my engines table, and then I have my engine details table, which I have so far. If I were to add, or if I were to alter the engine details table and add, let's say, for example, a column, that tracked, air intake, right? The next time I query that in my solution, I'm not going to have that, like, it potentially could break something, especially if I were to, well, actually, let me go back. A better example is if you ever delete a column on a table, it potentially could break something in your database. I should have started that to begin with. And because it's kind of in flux, I might not include displacement, or I might not include volumetric pressure. I might decide to take those out. I don't want to have to go back in my code and possibly break something while I'm still kind of like in the research and development phase. Whereas if I just start with a view and just define, hey, these are the things I want from this table, it doesn't matter if that's broken, because the next time your view, you can reconstruct your view in the table and handle it that way. I know some places do that for read-only operations. They use views. Some places don't. It's kind of like a where you're at kind of thing, right? It's like some places practice that, some places don't. You kind of, I think, like, obviously it's really used for if you have multiple data sources and you want to join them together in a single virtual table. That way you can just query one and not have to do all the fancy join logic on the front, on your back end, and that makes it really easy. So there's a benefit there. You don't have to do the joins on your server. You offload that to your database, which is nice. So you can kind of free up some space on your server or your back end. And also, again, you get the added advantage of you kind of get that one layer of protection, where if you alter a table, it's not going to immediately, break your code, right? Because so it depends how I'm going to do it. I think, again, it's subject to change. I think I'm leaning towards views. I don't know, but I'm going to make a video on it with my decision. For right now, I don't have views. I just have two tables. I'm going to be adding a lot more. Probably not in a video, just because it would be really repetitive content. I'm probably just going to show when my relational database schema is up to what I think is going to be a good working model. Because I still have to do all the user stuff. Like the user table. I have to do all the settings table. And things like that. And I really haven't got that far to think through. I still have to do all the diagramming and everything, assign relationships, keys, all that. So I got a lot of work to do on the database side still. But this is a good start. So now I know I have a path forward. I'm using MySQL Workbench. I'm going to do everything there. Another thing I want to put in the capture in the notes is that I decided on a migration framework. So I'm going to use Fluent Migrator to handle migrations. Migrations are a essential part of working with databases in terms of how you deploy your application. So let's say that you, for example, if you want to create a table, if you want to alter a table, delete a table, whatever actions you're planning on doing to your database, those need to be written somewhere. Migrations is a strategy for where you can basically define that logic, like create table, alter table, drop table, and have it run from your code every time your code is basically deployed. Your migrations are going to run in that environment, and then your database is going to be up to whatever the latest migration has it. And it also gives you the ability to roll back if something affects it. Like, let's say you deploy code, break something, you got to roll back. Well, if you have a down method on your migration, it'll just remove that change. It's really easy, and it's really an essential part of enterprise software, right? For at least in the .NET world, is to define your migrations. Migrations have an up and down method. Basically, the up is what as you're migrating up, this is what's going to happen. If you roll back, this down method is what's going to execute then. So basically, usually they're the inverse of each other, the up and down methods, at least for the logic, or they generally should be as much as you can. So that's what I'm going to use. I'm going to use Fluent Migrator to handle that. So I think I added two initial migrations. Now I probably, to be honest with you, I may combine them into one migration because I'm adding two tables. I kind of have them separated out to separate files currently, separate migrations. I may combine those. I have to see. I'll see. I'll think about that. I don't know. But this is how it is for right now. So that's at least where we're at for the research part. So we did add that code. That's going to be out in part 2, I believe, of the coding videos. So you will see that. Excuse me. And so next time, I don't know if there's going to be a part 3. Depends on where I get in the video in the code. But anyway, so we've defined the database. We have our migration framework called Fluent Migrator. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. We defined our. I'll say we defined the pattern for data retrieval in .NET. So we're using We're going to use DTO objects, and those are. Is it database transform objects or is it data transform objects? It might just be data. I'm going to call it data. Probably look that up though. Data transform objects. So basically, the general, and I know some people, it's like it's going to sound like you're just adding layers of unnecessary obscurity to your application. But here's the thought process, right? So you have your data transform objects, which are your entities. So those model exactly what your database tables look like. So I'm going to write that. These model the DB tables. So if I have a user engines or an engine details table, I have an engine details DTO object. And that's going to be an exact, one for one match of the database table. So that's going to be used for the actual retrieval of the used for the repository methods accessing the database. So you know that these objects are not going to be, you don't mess with, typically you don't touch these objects. There's a couple ways you can do this. I don't know if I might use record types, just because you want to treat these as immutable objects. Really, that's kind of the pattern. So they're supposed to be immutable, and you kind of get that out of the box now with record types in C#, which records are just a fancy read-only class. That's all it is, right? Records have been around, I think, in F# in a particular form. Everything's kind of getting ported over to C# to make it more functional, so to speak. But yeah, it's just a fancy read-only class. If you go into the definition, you're just going to see a bunch of read-only properties. So, but anyway, so we're going to define DTO, and then we're going to define our actual, I don't know what I'm going to call these specifically. I'm going to call them models. So these are the actual objects that you're going to interact with, right? So the general thinking is behind this is you want an object that directly mirrors your database table. And that's immutable, that you don't act on. But then you want another object that you can interact with, right? So the general thinking is that if we it basically adds another layer of protection, right? So if you modify something in your database, then you have to change the database transform object or the DTO object, so that you always get that direct mirroring. But the actual object that you are interacting with does not necessarily have to match the database. Does that make sense? The model can be potentially a combination of several DTO objects, but the thinking is that the object that you're interacting with, potentially changing the values and everything, that shouldn't be reflective of what the database is. It shouldn't care. It should just be, hey, this is the object, this has data. Now you can do with it what you want. Some people, this is like a debated thing, right? This is just one particular design, right? Because you have to have some design, right, for this. Some people argue that it just adds another unnecessary layer abstraction, and I get that. But on the other side of the coin, it's like you don't want to have a data structure coming back that models your database to be mutable, right? You don't want to be like, because then you don't know what's truly coming back from your database. You don't know if you had multiplied the value by 2 or changed that string or something like that. You want to know that this object has what the database has. And that's just kind of gives you this allows you to know that if it's a DTO object, it hasn't been touched, and this is what it is. You could go and read a lot more about it. That's just my thinking and understanding of it. So this one is, the model is going to be a mutable object that has either 1/many DTO object values. So I don't know how I'm going to structure that yet. If I'm going to have like just an engines model, that's going to be a combination of, user engines, engine details. It probably is going to be that. I want to consolidate it now as much as I can to engine, and I want to have the engine objects have everything. That's kind of what I'm hoping to do, and this DTO pattern will let me do that. I will say though, another thing that you want to keep in mind is what if you're using an object relationship mapper, so an ORM, if you're using if you're using entity framework, DTO is really where is going to be very important, because you need that DB set, right, to model your table. You need that entity. For me, I'm not going to use entity framework. I'm going to use Dapper, but I would argue that the same point still applies. So for me, I'm going to use Dapper as my SQL connection or SQL provider. So basically Dapper is just allows you to write raw SQL statements and execute those against the database. This is real important because I like to see the SQL, and oftentimes it's a little more efficient than Entity Framework. But just having the ability just to go in the code file and see the actual executed SQL, you can't beat it, right? Because then you copy and paste it into your database and see what it's going to bring back. In Entity Framework, you either have to launch a code diagnostic session and see what the converted SQL is from Link, or you got to use LinkPad or something that converts that, because you're not going to know what, especially if you start doing joins in Link gets really complicated very fast. If you do dot includes, and then a row from another object, or an object from a property from another object that represents another column from a table, you're going to have crazy joins going on under the hood. You're going to have Link is really powerful, or EF Core, very powerful tools and very, very easy to access databases, but it has a lot of assumed knowledge, and it does a lot of stuff that you might not be aware of, particularly around the SQL that it produces, how it stores, how it handles connection pooling to the database, how it handles encoding, how it handles collation, and a lot of things that you kind of take for granted because of how easy it is. Dapper, you have to write the SQL, and that's what I want to do. And it's a really powerful tool to help you also kind of get in the practice of just working with SQL, manipulating it, and getting used to seeing what it does, right? And we all like to not have stuff like just happen without us knowing. So Dapper is a really great tool. So we're going to use Dapper. I'm going to call it a SQL provider, right? It's a lightweight ORM is what it technically is, but you have to define the mapping. So defining the mapping is not difficult. It's actually kind of neat how it works. It's real simple. Basically, just kind of like delimits on columns. So it's like you specify, or not columns. Columns. It delimits on columns. So it's like if you have two objects and you pull data from two tables, you specify the column at which you want to make that partition. So you say, hey, these properties go with this object, these properties go with that object. It's pretty neat, but the syntax, I will say, the syntax is real weird. I don't like the syntax at all. So you just kind of have to, honestly, ChatGPT is a great tool if you don't like the syntax. The syntax is a little hard to read. I will say that. But once you kind of get the pattern, it's code. You can write wrappers if you don't like that. So it's just setting you up the first time that's can be a little odd. And I'm gonna have to look it up. I don't remember the syntax. Who remembers syntax though? Anyway, that's everyone. We all looked that stuff up. Okay, so we have DTO, models, Dapper, and was there? Obviously, we're gonna have to establish the data. How should I say this? Database connection provider, I guess. Basically, we gotta use dependency injection, right? We need to have dependency injection. So we got to inject the connection into the repository class. Oh, sorry. Okay, before that, I'm getting ahead of myself, kind of. So before we specified the connection provider, we out of this research that I did, we're going to have services and repositories. So the service is going to call the repository. The service does all the logic. The service is called from the controller, and the repository. The only thing the repository does is execute the SQL against the database and return the data. It doesn't do any logic whatsoever. It says, okay, hey, execute this SQL, return the data, and that's it. That's the responsibility of that. The service is takes the data from the repository method and then acts on it. It converts the DTO object over to your model or whatever conversions, whatever you're doing to the data, it's going to happen in the service. So that's what we're going to do. So we need to be able to, so once we have that pattern, we need to inject the dependency injection into repository, because the repository needs access to the database. So we need to create a basically connection provider class that's going to build a connection and then inject that connection into the repository, because you don't want the repository methods creating new connections every call, because you would have so many connections to the database pooling, and that'd be real bad. Ideally you want one connection for your whole application, and then you want to establish pooling, right? How many connections are allowed to be open. So basically you want ideal world, and there's going to be some caveats to this. We want to be able to inject the connection into our repository, and obviously, ideally, we like to have a singleton scoping to the database, right? We don't want to, it's how are we going to register that service, right? I have to see if it's going to register as a singleton, okay, in our setting or in our context. It might have to be, I don't know. That's what I might have to research that a bit. So I want to put a little question mark next to that. Does that make sense? That's what we need to do. That's what we have to set up. So we need to say, hey, our repository needs to be injected the connection to the database. After that, we need to set up the options pattern, options configuration. So basically, options. You have an app settings file in your .NET solution, right? So this app settings file is a JSON file that can hold settings for your application, and this gets built. This is built on app startup pipeline. So basically, when your application starts up, it runs these series of middleware pipelines that basically builds routing MVC endpoints, and then also it registers the options. So your settings, they just call it it's options pattern. It's trying to think of how to explain it. The configuration is set in this app settings file, and whatever you need to put in there is added to it on startup. So in our case, we need to give it credentials. We need to give it the database credentials. And then I'm going to put a big caveat for right now. we're just going to hard code the username and password into my app settings file. So hard code. But I would say that this is not. We will need to change this to use a secrets provider. So basically, just a security thing in application. You don't want any hard coded credentials right anywhere. You should be using a secrets store, a secrets provider. Basically is like this external service that you're authenticated to, basically, and then you call that service and say, hey, I need these values, can you return them to me? And then you'll return that. So basically that'll happen on your application startup. It'll make a request to that and bring them back. So that'll allow you to dynamically load in credentials to your app settings file, depending on what your environment is, right? So if you have from whatever hosting platform you are, you can set environment variables like your environment. So test, production. So it's like if you're in test, it'll give you these credentials in this connection string. If you're in production, it'll give you the production's environment. So we'll have to do that for the connection string too. Let me change this. So hardcode connection string, and then again, we will need to change that to use secrets provider. So it looks like a lot of work. Database connections and establishing the pattern to do that is just a lot of configuration, kind of overhead mainly. But once you get it, you don't really have to touch it. You know what I mean? Like once you get your startup configuration set up, once you get all the secrets you need, the connection string, your provider, all that stuff figured out with a good pattern, it makes adding new SQL, it makes adding everything really, really easy. But honestly, this is a massive part of application development, right? It's just figuring out these weird, obscure design patterns that work. And this is just something that, it just comes kind of with, programming, right? You just have to figure out, okay, does this work in this setting? Does that work in this setting? Well, what happens if that? And getting a solid connection to a database is a really big aspect of software engineering in these applications, and it takes a lot of time, and you can see it's going to be a lot of work. Like this is going to be a lot of tickets that we're going to have to make, but this is why you need a research ticket, right? Because you need to identify all these areas that we're going to have to do. So next time around, because we've kind of already been at this for, I think, a while. How long? 30 minutes. So we got to cap it here. This is a long stand-up. But next time, we're going to be actually breaking these into stories, and then we're going to kind of assign them as is. So as far as my research, I'm going to leave it in progress because I'm going to wait till I make the stories to then move the research ticket into done. I'm going to slide my home controller back into in progress. I'm going to wait on it until I get some of this stuff figured out first. So the one active one is the research, right? So database provider. So we got our notes and we got our plan for tomorrow. So I think we are good to call it here. So I will see you all tomorrow.